The courtroom was silent except for the steady ticking of the old wall clock. Wooden panels creaked faintly, worn smooth by years of quiet tension. People sat frozen in the gallery, holding their breath, watching a man who did not move. "Ethan Cross," the judge said, voice stern but not unkind, "you have been found guilty of murder in the 2nd degree. This court hereby sentences you to 14 years in the Central Penal Facility." The gavel struck. Ethan didn't blink. To the jury, to the public, to the court, he looked like a cold, remorseless killer. His eyes didn't water. His lips didn't quiver. There was no visible grief, no outburst, only a faint flicker in his gaze like the dim glow of a dying light bulb. The bailiff placed a hand on his shoulder. He stood. The chains clinked around his wrists and ankles. His mother, seated 3 rows behind, began to sob softly, a tissue pressed to her lips. Ethan didn't turn around. As he was escorted from the courtroom, he briefly glanced at the stained glass window at the far end, a depiction of blindfolded justice holding the scales. He stared at it just long enough for something inside him to fracture. The prison van smelled of rust and sweat. Rain tapped against the roof in a steady rhythm like a heartbeat. Ethan stared through the barred window as the city blurred past. He didn't see buildings or lights. He saw moments, a flash of red, a hand, a scream. He shut his eyes. The van rumbled over a pothole, jarring him into the present. His cell was small and sterile, walls a lifeless gray. The metal bed groaned under his weight. A single bulb flickered overhead. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded, unmoving, until he heard it. A voice, not from outside, not from down the hall. From within. "You took the fall well," it said. Ethan looked up. The bulb swung slightly, casting moving shadows on the wall. "But you always were good at staying quiet. That's why they never saw you, isn't it?" He exhaled slowly. "Not now," he muttered. "Now is all we have," another voice said, softer, older, like a tired schoolteacher. He put his head in his hands. "Let us help," said a third, feminine, gentle. Ethan clenched his jaw. No, but then came the fourth, the one he feared, the voice that was rough, distorted, full of smoke and gravel. "They think you're a killer," it hissed. "Maybe it's time you gave them what they want." Ethan stood suddenly, knocking over the metal stool. His breath quickened. He stumbled to the wall, pressing his forehead against the cold concrete. "Leave me alone," he whispered. "We're you," the voices echoed. He slid down to the floor, shaking. He didn't sleep that night. His mind pulsed with fragments of old conversations, forgotten laughter, the crackle of a cigarette lighter, the scent of rain-soaked pavement. He remembered a man with calloused hands who fixed bicycles and smelled of motor oil. A woman who sang old Yugoslav lullabies and stroked his hair when the thunder came. A friend who once took a punch for him behind the school gym. Bits and pieces of a life lived in shadows, always surviving, never truly seen. And buried deep beneath it all, a memory with no name, only a feeling. Terror, rage, blood. The next morning, the prison psychiatrist called him in. "Ethan," the woman said kindly, tapping her pen against a clipboard, "do you remember what happened the night of the incident?" He looked at her, and for a moment his eyes shifted, just enough. Which one of us should answer? Said the voice in his head. Ethan smiled faintly. "Not yet," he said. She raised an eyebrow. He stood, offered no resistance as he was led back to his cell, but something had changed. Inside his mind, a door creaked open, and someone, many someones, stepped out into the light. Ethan Cross was no longer alone in his cell. The voices had multiplied, filled the space with their murmurings, and each one was a fragment of someone he had known, someone he had admired, feared, or loved. At first, it was subtle, the occasional whisper, a fleeting thought that seemed almost like a memory. But soon it became undeniable. His mind was a crowded room, and the inhabitants were growing restless. The first to emerge was Alex. He had been Ethan's childhood friend, the kind of person who never hesitated to speak his mind and always took the hit when necessary. He was brave, reckless, and fiercely loyal. Ethan could feel his presence like a weight on his shoulders, an anchor to the past. "You've been good at pretending, haven't you?" Alex's voice mocked, a grin hanging in his tone. Hiding in plain sight, too quiet for them to notice, too smart to get caught. Ethan clenched his jaw and tried to block out the words, but it was impossible. He could hear Alex like he was standing right beside him. "You didn't kill her," Alex continued, voice suddenly softer. "You know that, right? She was never supposed to be in the middle of it." Ethan's breathing became shallow. He pressed his palms against his temples, desperate to shut the voice out. His mind spiraled back to that night, the night it all went wrong. The woman, the blood, the confusion. A new voice interrupted, this one more familiar still. It was Rachel, his first love, the girl who had taken his heart and never given it back. She was a whisper, a soft caress of memory, and yet her presence in his mind was undeniable. "Ethan, you always thought you could save me," Rachel's voice whispered, "but I wasn't yours to save, not then, not now." Her words were like a dagger to his chest. His heart thudded painfully in his ribcage. He had failed her, he had failed them all, but it wasn't just Alex and Rachel. Other voices followed, faces and names from the past that had once meant something to him. A teacher who once praised his work and told him he was destined for greatness. An old man in the park who had shared life lessons over cracked coffee cups. Each voice added to the noise, and together they formed a cacophony in Ethan's mind that he couldn't escape. "They all thought you were a hero," said another voice, gravelly and bitter. It was Carl, the man who had taught him to fight, the one who had been both mentor and tormentor. But heroes don't get their hands dirty. Ethan gritted his teeth, his knuckles white from clenching his fists. He hated this. He hated the voices, the way they twisted his memories, warped his perception. "You've been hiding for so long, Ethan," Carl's voice continued, growing louder, "but you can't run anymore, not from me, not from yourself." Ethan felt a tremor in his chest. The room was spinning, the walls closing in around him. His vision blurred as the voices grew louder, sharper, blending into a single, unified scream. He was drowning in their accusations, their expectations, their demands. "Give them what they want," the voice he had been dreading hissed. It was deep, low, and full of anger. "They think you're a killer. It's time to show them." It was the last voice, the one that had always haunted him. The voice of the man he feared becoming, the man he had always tried to suppress. The voice of violence, of rage. Ethan couldn't block it out any longer. "Shut up," he screamed, falling to his knees in the center of the room. His chest heaved with the weight of his breath. "I'm not you." But as the silence filled the cell, he could feel the presence of the voices shift. They weren't gone, not yet, but they were watching. Waiting. Ethan sat in the darkness, trembling, the sounds of the past pressing against him. He knew one thing for sure, the battle had only just begun. Ethan's mind was no longer just a prison of voices. It had become a battlefield, a place where every inch of mental ground was fought for, where every memory, every whisper, every regret clawed for dominance. But there was one voice that always loomed over the others, the one he could never escape. It was the voice of the man, the one who had always been there, lurking in the deepest corners of his mind. The voice that seemed to know everything about him, that could reach into the very marrow of his being and twist it into something dark, something dangerous. "You think you're better than me." The voice was low, full of contempt. It slithered through Ethan's consciousness, coiling around his thoughts like a snake preparing to strike. "You've always been weak, hiding behind your memories, behind your friends, behind the lies you tell yourself." Ethan clenched his fists, feeling the cold steel of his cell's walls against his back. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. He could feel the weight of his past bearing down on him like 1,000 chains pulling him toward the ground. "You've always been a coward," the voice continued, its tone mocking, venomous. "You ran from everything, from me, from what you really are." The room seemed to contract, the shadows growing long and oppressive. Ethan's chest tightened as memories, broken, fragmented pieces of his life, flooded his mind. He remembered the first time he had ever felt anger so fierce it consumed him. The first time his hands had clenched around something, not out of fear, but out of sheer, unbridled rage. He remembered the night the woman had died. The night that had sealed his fate. He had never meant to kill her, he hadn't, but the rage had consumed him. It always did, just like it had consumed the man inside of him, the one he had tried to bury, the one that was always there, waiting for the right moment to rise. "You're nothing without me," the voice hissed. "I am you, and you are me. There's no escaping me." Ethan collapsed to his knees, his hands gripping his head as the voices swirled around him, louder, faster. He could hear Alex's voice, Rachel's, Carl's, all of them blending together, their demands growing unbearable. But there was something else now, something far darker. It was the man's voice, and it was stronger than all the others. "What will you do, Ethan?" The man's voice echoed, chilling and deep. "Will you keep pretending? Will you keep hiding from the truth? You know what you are," Ethan's mind screamed. No, I'm not you, I'm not him," but the man didn't listen. The words were becoming more insistent now, more forceful. "It's too late," the voice taunted. "You've always known what you are, what you were meant to be." The pressure in Ethan's mind grew unbearable. His hands were trembling, his heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. The walls of the cell seemed to close in, and the voices became a cacophony, a single, overwhelming roar that filled his every thought. And then the door to his mind, his own mental prison, cracked open. It wasn't loud. There were no dramatic sounds, no sudden bursts of light. It was a simple shift, a shift in awareness, in focus. Ethan stood, his body stiff and rigid. He looked around, his eyes wide and unseeing, his breathing slowed. The voices in his head seemed to pause just for a moment. In that silence, he realized something. He realized that the man, the voice that had terrorized him, that had haunted his every step, was him. "You think you can defeat me?" The voice snarled, full of rage. "I am you. You've always been weak, hiding behind all these different faces." Ethan's lips curled into a small, bitter smile. The cold, bitter anger that had always threatened to overtake him, it didn't feel like a curse anymore. It felt like power. "No," Ethan whispered, barely audible, but the conviction in his voice sent a shock through the air. "I'm done hiding." The air around him seemed to shift. His entire body felt as if it were being pulled in two directions at once, one toward the man he feared, and the other toward the man he had always been, the one who had buried the rage for so long, pretending it didn't exist. His hands shook as he reached up and touched the sides of his head, as if he could physically shut out the voices. But it wasn't about shutting them out anymore, it was about controlling them. "I'm not you," Ethan said, his voice steady, louder now. "I've never been you, I am me." The room seemed to grow darker, colder. The shadows stretched longer, and the voices, Alex, Rachel, Carl, grew silent, their demands fading into the background. Ethan stood tall, his body tensed, as though he were ready to confront the most dangerous thing in the world, the man he had always feared himself. Ethan closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a victim. He didn't feel like someone trapped in a corner by his own past. He felt powerful. He felt free. "This is my fight," he said, his voice now a steady, resonant force that seemed to fill the entire room. "And I will win." The air shifted again. Something had changed inside Ethan. The man, the voice, was no longer in control. Ethan had taken back the reins. He was no longer hiding, no longer afraid of the shadows in his mind. He had faced his greatest fear, and he had emerged. The silence that had followed Ethan's declaration was almost suffocating. He stood tall, feeling the weight of his newfound power settle into his bones, his mind finally in control. The voices, the chaos, they had faded. He was no longer the scared, tortured man who had entered the prison. He was someone new, but just as he began to believe that he had won, that he had truly taken control, the room shifted. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't loud. But it was there. The air became heavy again, thick with something unseen, something hidden. "You think you're free." The voice, the man's voice, was not gone. It had just changed. Ethan's pulse quickened. His hands trembled again, but this time not from fear, from something else, something he hadn't expected. The walls seemed to pulse with the echo of that voice, not like before. It wasn't mocking, wasn't full of rage, it was calm, too calm. Did you think you could escape me that easily?" The voice coiled around his thoughts, tighter, drawing closer. Ethan's mind recoiled. No, this isn't how it's supposed to be. For a brief moment, the memories, the faces faded into the background. The twist was so subtle, so quiet, that it almost made him question if it was real. But then the truth hit him. He hadn't taken control. He had never really fought the man. He had only unleashed him. All this time, he had been playing a game with himself, telling himself that the enemy was outside, that the battle was about control. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was that the man had always been a part of him, just like the other voices. And now he had accepted the most terrifying fact of all: the man was never his enemy, he was his ally. "You didn't think you were the only one capable of surviving, did you?" The voice purred, silky and smooth. "I am the part of you that never gives up. I am the one who has always made sure you stay alive." Ethan's heart pounded as the realization sunk in. He had thought he had defeated his demons, but he hadn't. He had just given them a new role to play, and now the very thing he feared most, the thing he had been fighting, was the thing that had helped him survive. "I didn't want to be alone anymore," the man's voice whispered. "I don't want to be you, I want to be free too." Ethan stumbled backward, shaking his head. The weight of his new realization pressed down on him, crushing the remnants of his newfound power. Everything he had believed, everything he had fought for, it was all a lie. "You were never in control," the voice murmured with dark affection. "We've always been one." The walls around him seemed to close in again, the shadows stretching toward him as if the very darkness was coming to life. He wasn't sure who he was anymore. The man, the voices, had he ever been more than them? He raised his head, eyes wide with confusion, with terror. The truth had always been just out of reach, like a half-forgotten dream. "You're not alone anymore, Ethan," the voice now echoed from the very corners of his mind. "But neither am I." The realization hit him like a cold slap across the face. There had never been one Ethan. There had never been one truth. There had only ever been the pieces, the fragments of a fractured mind, and he had always known it. Deep down, he had always known that there was no escape from himself. As the shadow of the man loomed larger in his mind, Ethan understood he wasn't just battling his demons, he was battling himself. And in the end, the battle would only end when they were both whole. The silence fell once more, but it wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating. And in that silence, Ethan felt the cold grip of truth close around him. The silence in Ethan's mind had become almost unbearable. The shadows of his past, the voices of the man, and the ghosts of his memories all hovered around him like a storm about to break. He had never been more certain of one thing: he could not escape himself. The man inside him, the darkness he had always tried to outrun, had become a part of him in a way that felt irrevocable. But even as the weight of this truth pressed down on him, something inside Ethan shifted. A faint whisper, a tremor of hope that he thought had long disappeared, stirred within him. "You think it's over," the man's voice rasped, cold and calculating, "but it's just beginning." Ethan stood in the center of the room, his body rigid, the walls pressing in around him. The man's voice had been louder, more forceful than ever before, but now it felt different. It wasn't anger or hatred anymore. It was something worse: disappointment. "You've failed," the man whispered, his tone almost pitying. "You've always failed." But Ethan felt something shift, a flicker like a spark lighting a fire. His chest tightened as the realization began to unfold. For the first time, he didn't feel like a victim. He didn't feel like a man caught in a war within himself. He felt alive. The sudden clarity was blinding. All of it, everything he had fought for, was a lie. The man, the voices, the battle, it was all a game, a distraction, a way to keep him from seeing the truth. "No," Ethan said, his voice shaking but firm. "You don't get to control me anymore." The room seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, a rising tension that wrapped around him like an invisible chain. The man's voice grew louder, more forceful, but something in Ethan's mind held it at bay. "You think you can stop me?" The man's voice boomed, angry and threatening. "You're nothing without me. You're nothing without us." Ethan clenched his fists, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts, memories, and emotions. But through it all, one thing stood out above everything else. He had always been in control. He had always been the one choosing to fight, choosing to survive, even when he thought he was weak, even when the voices drowned out everything else. He was the one who had decided to keep going. "I am not you," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking through the chaos. "I am me." And in that moment, everything changed. The storm that had raged inside him, the rage, the confusion, the fear, began to dissipate. The voices in his head faded into the background, their power diminishing with every breath he took. The man's grip on him weakened, his presence starting to fade, as though retreating into the depths of the darkness from which he came. The air grew still, calm. The oppressive weight of the room lifted, and for the first time, Ethan felt light, truly light. The twist, the struggle, the fight, they had all been about one thing: understanding. Understanding that the enemy wasn't some dark force outside of him. It wasn't the man, it wasn't the rage or the voices or the memories. It was his fear. His fear of losing himself, his fear of letting go. Ethan opened his eyes, and for the first time, he saw the truth with clarity. The world outside his cell didn't matter. His past didn't matter. The voices didn't matter. What mattered was that he had chosen to be free. "You were never in control," the man's voice whispered one final time, almost tenderly. "You were always the one being controlled." Ethan's breath caught, but instead of fear, there was only peace. He smiled, a quiet, bittersweet smile. It wasn't a victory over the man or the voices. It was a victory over himself. And as the last traces of the man's presence faded away, the door to his cell creaked open, the harsh light from the hallway spilling into the darkness. Ethan stepped forward, the weight of years of internal struggle lifting with every step. He was free.